You can't leave. The clerk's whisper was louder than a scream. I stood at the federal building counter in Chicago, gripping a crumpled eviction notice and my last $25. I wasn't there for a vacation. I was desperate for a janitor job, a final attempt to keep my head above water. But as the clerk scanned my file, the sterile office air was sliced by a violent, pulsing red. A silent alarm strobe began to spin on the wall, casting a rhythmic, bloody glow over the counter. Two armed guards stepped forward, their hands hovering over their holsters with lethal intent. The clerk's hands shook as she looked up at me, her face drained of all colour. "Ma'am," she breathed. "This social security number belongs to a child who died in 1991. Sitting here with my coffee, watching the world go by, I'm struck by how fragile our reality really is. What's your favourite drink or time of day right now? I truly look forward to your comments." But back to that cold office in Chicago, where the only life I knew was about to vanish. The red strobe light continued its frantic pulse, painting the guards' faces in flashes of warning. My heart was a trapped bird, but my mind had already gone cold. Just as the elevator dings, the guard's tension snaps. A man in a tailored black suit stepped out, walking through the armed perimeter with the ease of someone who owned the air he breathed. He didn't look at the guns or the panicked clerk. He looked straight at me, his eyes filled with a recognition that terrified me more than the Glock 17s pointed at my chest. He stopped exactly 2 feet away and whispered 3 words that incinerated my entire reality. "Welcome back, Eleanor." He didn't read me my rights. Instead, he led me into a soundproof office that smelled of expensive espresso beans and aged leather. It was a world I had only seen through the windows of the houses I cleaned. He poured me a glass of ice water, the rattle of the cubes against the glass, the only sound in the room. As I took a sip, the sharp, rich scent of the coffee hit me, and it made my stomach turn. For 14 years, my signature scent had been industrial-grade bleach, and the damp, stagnant air of the laundry room where I slept. The man, Agent Bradley, slid a thick manila folder across the mahogany desk. He flipped it open to reveal a digital rendering and age progression photo of a young woman. The rapid DNA test we ran against the 1,991 cold case database came back 10 minutes ago. It's a 99.9% match, Eleanor. You aren't just a resemblance. You are a biological certainty. She had my jawline, my exact nose, and my eyes. But she didn't look like she spent her nights calculating how to survive another month on minimum wage. She looked loved. "Your name is Eleanor Hayes," Bradley said softly. "You are the sole heir to a Silicon Valley real estate and tech empire worth $400 million. You weren't abandoned, and you weren't a mistake. You were kidnapped from a park in 1991. The word kidnapped should have broken me. I should have felt the walls closing in. But instead, it felt like a balance sheet finally being reconciled. All the years Gary, my stepfather, had looked at me with disgust, calling me a burden and a leech, suddenly made sense. He hadn't been an unloving guardian. He had been a warden guarding a crime scene. He hadn't kept me out of the goodness of his heart. He had been using my stolen identity as a subscription to a life he didn't earn, with me footing the bill in blood and sweat. I didn't cry. I didn't ask for a hug. I looked Bradley in the eye and felt the first surge of clinical, needle-sharp clarity. This wasn't about a missing child anymore. This was a hostile takeover. Gary had spent 14 years overdrafting on my compassion, believing I was too broken to ever check the ledger. He was wrong. The victim he thought he'd groomed into silence was dead. The witness was awake. And I didn't want an apology. I wanted an accounting of every cent, every minute, and every breath he had stolen from me. "What happens next?" I asked, my voice as steady as a judge's gavel. In my mind, the Chicago skyline vanished, replaced by the damp, grey walls of Gary's laundry room. That was my designated space. Gary hadn't even given me the dignity of my real name. He called me June, a placeholder for the life he was slowly erasing. I remember watching them through the large bay window of the dining room. Gary and his biological daughter Kayla would sit under the warm golden glow of the chandelier, cutting into thick, bleeding steaks that cost more than I made in a week. I could hear the clink of crystal glasses, a sound that represented a world I was told I didn't deserve to touch. I was always on the other side of that glass, clutching a cold sandwich made from the heel of a bread loaf. When I dared to knock on the pane, begging for a moment of warmth, Gary would open the door just enough to loom over me like a shadow. Steak is for people who contribute. June, he'd say. His voice a smooth, self-righteous poison. You're lucky I even keep a roof over your head. You should be on your knees thanking me for the scraps. For a long time, I believed him. I carried the weight of that perceived debt like a physical stone in my chest, believing I was a mistake that needed to apologize for existing. But sitting across from Agent Bradley, the invisible chain Gary had wrapped around my mind finally snapped. It wasn't charity. It was a tactical investment. Gary hadn't been raising a stepdaughter. He had been grooming a witness to be grateful for her own prison. This was the invisible chain of the survivor, a psychological cage where the warden convinces the prisoner that the walls are a gift. Gary needed me broken so I wouldn't ask questions about why my face didn't match the names on the documents he kept locked away. He needed me desperate so I would never have the confidence to look at my own birth certificate. He was an identity trafficker who had turned my stolen life into a $400 million laundering scheme. Gary didn't just steal my name. He used my poverty as a human shield. He knew that a cleaning lady living in a laundry room was the perfect hiding spot for a $400 million paper trail. If I had looked like an heiress, the world would have started asking questions he couldn't answer. He kept me starving to keep his empire invisible. My existence as June, the burden was the camouflage he used to hide Eleanor the heiress. Every time he called me worthless, it was a move to protect his profit margin. He didn't hate me because I was unlovable. He hated me because I was a crime scene walking through his hallways. I rubbed my wrists, the skin still sensitive from the weight of the life I had been forced to carry. Gary had overdrafted on my silence for over a decade, but he forgot one thing about accounting. Eventually, the books have to balance. This wasn't a family drama anymore. It was a hostile audit, and by the time I was finished, I was going to make sure Gary realized that the mistake he had been hiding was the one person who was going to take everything he had built on my blood. The door to the soundproof office didn't just open. It exploded inward, with a violence that shattered the silence. I didn't even have time to scream before two uniformed deputies stormed the room, their hands resting on their weapons with a practiced, lethal intent. And striding in behind them, walking through the federal perimeter like he was entering his own living room, was Gary. He wasn't wearing the stained flannel shirts I was used to seeing him in. He was in an expensive, perfectly tailored wool suit, the fabric gleaming under the sterile office lights. He didn't look at Agent Bradley. He looked straight at me, and his eyes weren't filled with the anger I expected. They were dead. "Step away from the suspect," he barked, his voice echoing off the glass walls like a gavel. Bradley stood his ground, placing his body between me and the deputies. "This is a federal investigation, Gary," Bradley said, his voice dropping to a dangerous low. "You have no jurisdiction here." But Gary didn't flinch. As a former prosecutor, he knew exactly where the cracks in the system were hidden. He had manipulated his old connections to bypass the lobby security, waiving an emergency guardianship order and claiming I was a mentally unstable ward who had gone rogue. He wasn't just there as a father. He was weaponizing a local legal technicality to invade a federal stronghold, betting that his status would intimidate anyone who stood in his way. He slapped a folded piece of paper onto the mahogany desk with a sickening thud. "I have a warrant, signed by a county judge 15 minutes ago," Gary sneered. "Grand larceny, felony charges." He pointed a finger at me, the same finger that had poked my chest 1,000 times while he told me I was a mistake. "That woman stole $120,000 worth of legacy bonds from my bedroom before she fled this morning. I'm taking her into custody." "That's a lie!" I screamed, the clinical clarity in my head momentarily eclipsed by a surge of raw indignation. "I haven't been to your house in years." But Gary only smirked, a cold, calculated expression that told me he had planned this move long before I ever walked into this building. He nodded to his deputies. "Cuff her." One of the deputies grabbed my arm and twisted it behind my back with enough force to make my shoulder pop. I cried out, the pain blinding me for a second, but I didn't beg. I watched Bradley, looking for the savior he promised to be. I saw the calculation in his eyes as Gary stepped in close, chest to chest with the federal agent. "Careful, agent," Gary whispered, his tone dripping with a smooth, legislative threat. "This is a state crime, exigent circumstances. Unless you want to obstruct a felony arrest on the record, you'll step aside." Bradley hesitated. He knew that technically, a local felony warrant could pull me out if Gary claimed I was a flight risk. Gary was weaponizing the very bureaucracy Bradley served. The cold steel of the handcuffs bit into my wrists, the click of the lock sounding like a gunshot in the quiet office. Gary grabbed my arm, his grip bruising the muscle. He leaned in close, his breath hot against my ear, his voice a whisper intended only for me. "I told you never to dig, Eleanor," he hissed. "I told you to leave it alone. Now you're going to die in a holding cell. You'll hang yourself with a bedsheet before your rich parents even touch the tarmac." The blood drained from my body, but I didn't collapse. I realized then that Gary wasn't taking me to jail to book me. He was taking me to a private execution. Our history wasn't a family bond. It was a bad debt Gary was trying to write off permanently. He needed me to be a burden one last time, a body to be disposed of so his $400 million fraud could stay buried. "Move!" Gary shouted, jerking me toward the door. As the deputies began to drag me toward the elevator, I felt the familiar weight of the June persona trying to take over. The part of me that was trained to be a quiet, compliant prisoner. But that girl was gone. Gary had spent 14 years making me invisible. But today, I was going to be the most visible thing in his entire world. The hallway stretched out like a sterile tunnel, the fluorescent lights overhead blurring as the deputies half-marched me toward the elevators. Gary's hand was a vice on my bicep, his fingers digging into the tender flesh between muscle and bone. That grip, I knew it. I didn't struggle against their strength. I didn't pull away. Instead, I did something Gary didn't expect. I went completely limp. I dropped my entire body weight to the floor in a single, sudden motion. It's a trick you learn when you're forced to move heavy furniture alone. Dead weight is impossible to move gracefully. The sudden drop caught the deputy on my left off guard. His grip slipped, his boots skidding on the polished linoleum, and we jerked to a halt exactly 10 feet from the elevator bank. "Get up," Gary snarled, yanking on my arm with a desperate purple-faced rage. "Stop making a scene!" I didn't get up. I planted my heels and slowly straightened my spine, pulling against the handcuffs until the steel chain was taut and biting into my skin. I turned my head and looked directly into Gary's eyes. For the first time in 14 years, I didn't flinch. I didn't look down. I let him see exactly what he had created. The victim was gone. The witness was awake. "Bradley!" I yelled. My voice didn't crack. It didn't plea. It was an order. "Check the timestamp. Look at the warrant he signed." Gary's face shifted from rage to a flicker of genuine, frantic terror. "Shut her up!" he barked at the deputies. "Get her in the elevator now." But it was too late. Bradley didn't slow down. He didn't ask questions. He threw his body weight against the elevator doors just as they were sliding shut, forcing them back open with a screech of grinding metal. Two uniformed Federal Protective Service officers materialized from the security checkpoint, their hands on their weapons, blocking the exit. "Hold it!" Bradley barked. His voice wasn't the calm, soothing tone he'd used in the office. It was the voice of a man who commanded federal task forces. "Nobody moves. This is federal territory. I am a former prosecutor and a family guardian executing a lawful arrest," Gary roared, sweat now beating on his forehead. "Let me see the warrant," Bradley demanded, holding out his hand. He didn't ask. He waited. Gary clutched the paper to his chest for a split second to tell, the move of a poker player hiding a losing hand. Then, realizing he had 3 federal guns pointed in his general direction, he shoved the crumpled paper at Bradley. "Read it and weep. Agent. Grand larceny. Signed at 8 a.m. Sharp this morning." Bradley snapped the paper open. He scanned it once, then looked up at the digital clock above the security desk. Then, he looked at the security monitors behind the guard station. A cold, terrifying calm settled over him. "You're sloppy, Gary," Bradley said, his voice dropping to a whisper that felt like ice. He turned the paper around so the deputies could see it. This warrant was signed at 8 o'clock sharp, but my building's cameras logged Eleanor Hayes entering through the North metal detectors at 7:45 a.m. The lobby went dead silent. "She's been in federal custody since she walked in," Bradley said, stepping closer to Gary, invading his space. "Unless she can teleport, she couldn't have stolen $120,000 worth of bonds from your house at 8 o'clock if she was standing in my lobby 15 minutes earlier." The deputies holding me loosened their grip as if my skin had suddenly turned to fire. They looked at each other, then at Gary. They realized they weren't executing a legal arrest. They were accomplices to a kidnapping in progress. Gary stood alone in the center of the circle, his authority evaporating like mist in a furnace. His rented power had just run out of credit. "Release her now," Bradley ordered, his voice echoing with the weight of federal command. I scrambled backward across the polished floor, putting distance between myself and the man who had stolen my life for 31 years. Gary's face was a mask of purple, pulsating rage. Realizing he couldn't talk his way out of this, he finally broke. Gary's eyes were bloodshot, his facade of the sophisticated prosecutor shattering into pure, manic desperation. He didn't care about the federal cameras or the armed guards anymore. He was a man watching a $400 million empire vanish, and he was ready to burn everything down with him. "I'm not leaving without her," Gary screamed, his voice cracking with desperation. His hand flew to his belt. He ripped his taser from its holster, the yellow plastic gleaming under the lobby lights. He leveled it at Bradley. "Back off," he yelled. "I am taking custody of this suspect." He was holding a federal agent at gunpoint in a federal building. Gary knew it was over. He was just a cornered animal trying to survive the next 5 minutes. The guards reacted instantly. 3 Glock 17s snapped up in perfect synchronization, their barrels trained directly on Gary's chest. "Drop the weapon," Bradley ordered. Now, for a moment, it looked like Gary might force them to shoot him. Then, the madness drained from his eyes, replaced by the hollow realization of a man who had lost his leverage. He tossed the taser onto the marble floor and slowly raised his hands. "Fine," Gary sneered, salvaging his dignity. "Let's do this properly." He reached into his jacket. The guards tensed, but he pulled out a crumpled document. "You caught me," Gary said lightly. "The warrant was fake. I knew about the kidnapping. I helped cover it up. I kept you. I hid you. I stole your life." Bradley stepped forward with the handcuffs, but Gary just laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "No, I'm not under arrest," Gary said. "Check the calendar. The kidnapping happened in 1991. The statute of limitations for kidnapping and fraud expired in 2011. The lobby went dead silent. You can't touch me. I walk, and legally, you're still incompetent. I control your assets." "You're right about the statute," Bradley said, his voice dropping to a terrifying calm that stopped Gary mid-step. "But you forgot one rule." Bradley lifted a thick file from the desk. "The constructive trust doctrine." He dropped the file onto the counter with a thud that sounded like a coffin lid closing. "You don't own property obtained through fraud, Gary. In the eyes of the law, you simply hold it in trust for the victim. We traced the initial ransom money you laundered and every social security benefit you illegally claimed in her name. While she scrubbed floors in your laundry room, you were cashing checks signed by a ghost." "That's my money," Gary snapped, his composure finally shattering. "No," I said, stepping into his space, my voice cold and lethal. "You just managed it for me. You were the silent investor in my misery, but the debt has been called in." Bradley's voice cut through the air like a blade. "Civil fraud doesn't expire when the victim was a minor. Your $400 million tech empire? Every cent of it belongs to Eleanor. Your assets are frozen. Your house is seized. Your life is no longer your own." Gary recoiled, his face pale and terrified. He was afraid of being nobody. He had spent 30 years building an empire on a foundation of stolen air. This was the illusion of power, the belief that a castle built on sand is permanent because the walls are gilded. Gary's status was a rented costume, paid for with a child's life. But wealth isn't just about what you have. It's about the foundation beneath it. Gary never was a powerful man. He was just a renter of a stolen soul. And once the truth arrived, his status didn't just break. It evaporated. "But I'm the prosecutor!" Gary screamed, his voice shrill. "You laundered money and filed false federal taxes for decades," Bradley cut in. "Those clocks are still running, and they are counting down to zero right now." The federal guards moved in with purpose. Gary screamed as the handcuffs finally snapped shut. I leaned in, my voice a whisper he would never forget. "You were right about one thing, Gary. It's expensive to keep a mistake. And today, you're the one paying the bill." Gary's screams faded as the elevator doors hissed shut, leaving the lobby in a sudden, ringing silence. Agent Bradley slid a single piece of paper toward me. The asset transfer authorization. My hand was perfectly steady as I picked up the pen. For decades, I had been the silent investor in Gary's version of family, a subscription I never agreed to. Now, the contract was void. I signed my name not June, the burden, but Eleanor Hayes, the heir. "Sell it all," I told Bradley, sliding the paper back. I didn't want the luxury Silicon Valley estate or the high-rise offices built on the interest of my misery. I liquidated every asset, every account, and every cent Gary had laundered through my life. I took that $400 million and founded the Eleanor Hayes National Registry for Missing Children. I wanted to ensure that every stolen treasure had a way back home. This wasn't revenge. It was an accounting of the soul. The heavy glass doors of the federal building swung open, and the Chicago wind was eclipsed by a sudden, blinding warmth. Sunlight flooded the lobby. Two figures rushed in, their faces aged by 31 years of waiting and hoping. I didn't need the renderings or the files. I felt the connection in my bones. "Eleanor," the woman whispered, her voice breaking into 1,000 pieces of joy. They held me like they would never let go, and for the first time in my life, the ground beneath me didn't feel like it was about to disappear. I've come to realize that we are often taught that loyalty to family is a debt we can never repay. But as I discovered, sometimes that perceived debt is just a weapon used by wardens to keep you in a prison of your own gratitude. Gary spent years trying to convince me I was unlovable so that I would never look for my own light. He needed me to believe I was a mistake, so I wouldn't realize I was the evidence. If you find yourself in a similar situation, remember that your value isn't something someone else grants you. It's not a label you have to earn from people who only see you as useful. You don't have to stay small to fit into someone else's shadow. Forgiveness isn't always for the other person. Sometimes it's the only way to set yourself free from the labels they tried to tattoo onto your heart. You aren't broken, and you aren't a burden. You are a treasure that was hidden, waiting for the courage to finally see yourself. If this story reminded you of your own strength, hit that share button. We need to reach the ones who are still waiting for their own light to break through the dark. Don't forget to subscribe to join our community of survivors. We'll see you in the next one.